Yeah. So with an event like this, like a running event,
Yeah,
if you kind of think about the annual operations, obviously it's very concentrated on one weekend
one.
or
Yeah,
a week. And so, when you think about this, it is the people that are all coming into the event because the event is outside. So there might not be all that many scope one and scope two impacts specifically for facilities and things like that, like you would see for a Michigan football game or the Super Bowl that's coming up here based off
yeah,
of our recording time.
yeah.
But all that to be said, these events, because of their characteristics and their operations, we're starting to see, again, scope three be much, much higher percentages, whereas others may not be as high in that regard. And so that is one of the things there that we found is, again, scope three is extremely high, but we tried to make comparisons per participant. There's limitations with that approach, but then also a limitation of the data is like what's actually coming in because some might be reporting on certain areas, whereas others may not have exact or as precise data, which is kind of where we were kind of introducing this gray data concept.
Hey everyone, welcome back to What Runs a Run podcast and the special mini series Sustainability in 26.2, where we are exploring the intersection of movement and the environment. I'm your host, Kamal Datta, and joining me today is one of the world's leading experts in sport ecology. He is an associate professor at the University of Michigan and the director of the Center for Sport and Sustainability. He's worked with everyone from the International Olympic Committee to local road races to figure out how sport can survive the changing climate. Dr. Brian McCullough, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great. Brad, you have dedicated your career to sport ecology. For those of us who just think about lace up times and gels, and what does that term actually mean? And how did you find yourself at the intersection of kinesiology and environmental science?
Well, I'll give you the short version, or as best as possible. But so I've been involved in this line of research since about 2009. I was studying at Texas A&M. I'm originally from California, and so when I went down there to do my graduate work and trying to figure out what area of research I'll study, had the opportunity to really kind of explore different areas. And my advisor was looking at diversity issues in sport. And he's quite prolific in that area. And some initial, I guess, academic ego was kind of creeping in saying, how am I going to differentiate myself from him? And so I
Okay.
wanted to find something. I mean, I strongly believe in diversity research and diversity in workplaces and everything of that nature. But I wanted to kind of find something that, again, could be my own that wasn't being researched all that much. Kind of ironically, as we kind of talk about the paper later, we read a paper by Andrea Collins on the environmental impact of the FA Cup the Rugby World Cup in Wales. And
Mhm.
so I was thinking, okay, I love nature just growing up in California, that was just second nature to us growing up.
Right.
And so then we really started exploring that area. And so then kind of expanded from there and really jumped in, starting with behavioral analyses of game day behaviors, sustainable behaviors, and moved from there. But as we kind of went through this process, some of our academic journals weren't always accepting of sport and the environment. We would get some interesting comments back from reviewers saying, environmental sustainability and sport really don't go hand in hand. There were others like Andrea, Cheryl Mallon, Sylvia Trinifilova, Jonathan Casper, and others that were in this space as well. And we had similar frustrations. And so was collaborating with Madeline Orr and Timothy Kellison at the same time. And so we said, hey, how about we write a paper that starts to conceptualize what this body of research actually is?
Mhm.
So we can actually kind of put our flag in the ground and say, hey, this is something that's important to the field. So we came up with the term sport ecology, and that's the study of the bidirectional relationship between sport and the natural environment. So obviously the environment impacts sport, sport impacts the environment. And so it's really trying to understand how within this system they can at least have some harmony and whatnot. Not saying that we're going to eliminate all impact, but how can we do so and engage in sport, recreation, physical activity in sustainable ways? And The paper's been quite successful, I guess, in a lot of ways to be able to establish this as a
Yeah.
subdiscipline within sport management, and then also um, help us save some space in our journal articles to justify, or where we don't have to justify why sport and the environment matter.
That is so true. One of the primary reason we are chatting today because I came across your paper. It's in my hand that you published in 2023, and with some of the folks you mentioned, Andrea,
Hmm.
Jack, and Shelley. I think this is considered one of the first groundbreaking research, especially in Mars participation events. If I get it correct, right?
I'll take your word for it.
Okay. The first thing that I'm curious about, what are the questions that you're trying to get to when you started this project?
Yeah, so we had been working and talking with Council for Responsible Sport, and they were going through their process of improving or updating their certification for single events, but then also starting to introduce their certifications for individual organizations. And so, as we were going through this process and working with Shelley, who was with the council at the time, since I moved on to other opportunities, but we were when we were working with them, we said, what kind of data do you have? Just because as we start to create these, new frameworks or ways to report uh, sustainability in a holistic way, not just environmental, social, and economic, is what data do these organizers have and are providing you so you can start to understand their capacity.
Hmm.
And so they share that with us, and we were able to then use this within the publication itself. But it was trying to understand, and it's very difficult sometimes to compare apples to apples between the impacts of different events, but it's starting to say, like, how can we do that? And through this process of working with this manuscript, working with Andrea, Jack, and Shelley, and we really started to see kind of the challenges that the council had with working with clients. And that's not saying the council doesn't do great jobs; they're fantastic. But there's some limitations that these race organizing committees or kind of the employees that work there
Yeah,
have to be able to provide this information. And so this is kind of a challenge for those that are out there that have frameworks like this. But I mean, compliments to the council. They were very open to this and very willing to acknowledge kind of some of again, those challenges in that space. Whereas other organizations that we've worked with, and I won't name them, but they're sometimes very hesitant to kind of go public and say, "Hey, these are the challenges that we're dealing with."
I
And so
see.
again, compliments to the council for being able to do so.
Cool. So I think one of the things I got fascinated, because I know in this paper you deep into the running industry. I think you looked into 28 races in North America between the years 2014 and 2019. I'm just curious if you can to explain a little bit before you go into deeper dive into the data, like what is the framework that Council for Responsible Sport has that you took as a kind of a baseline? How do they go about accrediting a race that, okay, they are CRS certified as so? Kind of, I think there are 5 pillars, if I understand correct.
Right. I mean, but ultimately, like from our standpoint in this paper, we were really interested in kind of looking at scopes, 1, 2, and 3. So,
Right.
and I don't know how familiar your
Let's
listeners are.
let's explain.
Okay.
Let's assume that it's a clean slate for us.
Yeah. So, scope 1 would be the carbon emissions or the equivalent of those emissions. So, whether or not there's a direct correlation there, you can calculate and make an equivalent. So then you can kind of calculate aggregate together. So anyway, so scope 1 is looking at emissions that are generated directly by the organization or the event organizers themselves. So this could be non-reusable fuels that are used, includes, and as kind of the paper says, includes operations of vehicles by event
Hmm.
staff. Then scope 2 is starting to look at the emissions that are generated indirectly by the event organizers. So this is like purchased energy that they're
Yeah.
having for lighting, expos, or whatnot. And then, looking at food and drink preparations as well. And then scope 3, which typically for sporting events or any kind of live entertainment type of events, is going to be the largest. And that's, those impacts that are beyond the control of the event organizers. So again, instantly impact the event. So this could be, participant local travel. So once they're actually in the city, traveling around there, but also their long distance travel to get to the site. event operators, that are kind of purchasing goods and products. So that could be apparel and different things like that. And then disposal of waste to landfills, and then sewage. So when the porta potties, or honey buckets, as we call them in the Northwest,
Yeah.
got emptied. Those are all different things that kind of would fall under scope three.
Cool. And I know that I'll definitely put the link to the paper. I think this is explained in the table 1 on the paper
Yeah,
itself, all the 3
exactly.
scopes as with the definition itself. Now, what is in the control of the race organizers between this scope 1, 2, and 3, and what is not?
Yeah. So scope three is going to be beyond their control.
Okay.
And sometimes event organizers might be somewhat limited given kind of where their event is located when it comes to scope two, because of the capacity or infrastructure of that local community or municipality. And then those within scope one are, again, considered to be most directly in their control. But some of the aspects there might be organizational capacity, frankly, having strategic planning, or just having the mindset to be able to say, we're going to try to do things as sustainably as possible. And so while there are external constraints, there can also be internal organizational constraints that would prevent or perhaps kind of change what is perceived to be in their direct control or not.
Got it. Just to get to the outcome of your paper, I think one of the key data points that you called out is that the average event out of the 20 that you analyzed generated 3,363 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, which is around 0.23 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent per capita, per participant on those events. And that is 99.999% is scope 3 emissions, right?
Yeah. So with an event like this, like a running event,
Yeah.
if you kind of think about the annual operations, obviously it's very concentrated on one weekend
One.
or
Yeah.
a week. And so, when you think about this, it is the people that are all coming into the event because the event is outside. So there might not be all that many scope one and scope two impacts specifically for facilities and things like that, like you would see for a Michigan football game or the Super Bowl that's coming up here based off
Yeah.
of our recording time.
Yeah.
But all that to be said, these events, because of their characteristics and their operations, we're starting to see, again, scope three be much, much higher percentages, whereas others may not be as high in that regard. And so that is one of the things there that we found is, again, scope three is extremely high. But we tried to make comparisons per participant. There's limitations with that approach, but then also a limitation of the data is like what's actually coming in, because some might be reporting on certain areas, whereas others may not have exact or as precise data, which is kind of where we were kind of introducing this gray data concept.
Because the thing that fascinates me, especially the per capita data point, I think you compared with and per capita carbon dioxide emission for the whole year. It's almost the 50% of it, right? That's what you said. It's one day event, but it's kind of the emission for the scope 3 is more like 50% of CO2 emission of for per capita if you see in an individual level. You also concluded that total emission is between the NFL, which is National Football League. We talked about Super Bowl at the time of recording, of 17 million metric ton to with the Major League Baseball game, which is 65, close to 65 million metric ton. So it's in between the NFL and then the MLB, kind of the number. And that's kind of the intriguing factor that you deep dive into this data. The thing that I'm curious a little bit more on, how was the quality of the data? I think you called out a little bit about the gray data that you looked at. There are some gaps because that's kind of some of the action item. I think a recommendation is also in the paper on what the organizers can improve on collection of the data. You want to chime in a little bit on the gray data areas that you have seen when doing this
Yes.
research?
Yeah, definitely. Again, going back to the operations, and typically you'll have very small full-time or small numbers of full-time employees, that are hired year round, or full-time, fully employed employees. And so that becomes a challenge, right? So they're trying to be able to create, these strategic plans that they can roll out. And then typically you're either relying on short-term full-time employees or even volunteers that are, yes, helping with the operations. They might be purchasing gas for vans or generators or whatever it might be,
Yeah.
and then being able to make sure that you're collecting that data appropriately to then kind of then synthesize that and then report that back up. So there's a lot of chain of command there or different kind of hands that are touching that data. So it does make it challenging. And the capacity, as I refer to as well, to be able to say, like, hey, what and how can we collect this data? How can we then translate this into an impact? But there might be some that are, reporting, the exact number of gallons of gasoline that that they purchase, and then kind of translating that. Whereas others might be kind of saying, like, I guess we used a couple of this, a couple of that, right? And so there's imprecision that comes with it. And that's no fault of anybody's, but kind of goes into the challenges when we're starting to try to make comparisons between events, is that the quality of the data that might come in is not all that great, but also might be collected based off of the priorities of the event organizers themselves. And so they might say, this year, we're really trying to focus on reducing our emissions from gas powered or diesel powered generators. So we're going to go and rent, they're available to us, go rent electric generators
Hmm.
that are rechargeable, so then we could use that. And so there might be different priorities, and as they shift around, so there might be emphasis in one area versus others. Whereas waste management, that could be quite difficult.
Hmm.
Boston and New York have been quite successful in finding partners to introduce very cool ways of reducing the amount of waste when it comes to refill stations or watering stations as well as along
Hmm.
on the paths. And so those are some interesting things that we see, is that the not every race is the same, which is
Yeah.
great, but
Yeah.
also the capacities to be able to report on that data are not the same as well. And so it does make it, again, difficult to be able to do an apples to apples comparison.
Right. Right. The infrastructure and the capacity of the staff, I think, I believe the 6 out of the 28 races that you looked at were more than 20,000 participants. So I would think that the organizing body is larger than compared to the smaller races that you saw.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, there's definitely some advantages there. As you start to have these larger events that are kind of key destination events, then, we've been working with this kind of phenomena of kind of this, the aspect of, again, the more an event is attractive, the further out that you're going to have, people traveling. Just
Right.
like, looking at a local race versus one that might be a partner that we've worked with in another project, the Cherry Blossom Run in DC. They
Hmm.
have, a raffle to be able, or a lotto system to be able to run in the race. So very high demand. They still have good close proximity for participants, but there are people that will travel across the country, across the Atlantic, or do international travel to be able to get and compete in the race.
Cool. Now, given that the gray data area, I'm just curious for the audience, which may not know exactly how the intricacies of calculating the carbon footprint. If you want to, simplify explaining like how do you go? I think you use a lot of tools and frameworks. How do you calculate the carbon emission, right?
Yeah, so there's going to be different tools that are out there that you can be able to gather the information and try to clean the data. That's probably the longest process of it. But then you can have different equivalents for if they're keeping track of water consumption, natural gas, petrol, and all these different things. And so you can start to have these different calculations, and then the calculations as well of people traveling to the event. And that kind of gets into a whole nother kind of nuance. So you have all these different methodological approaches for whatever material might be consumed or exhausted, and then trying to find the CO2 equivalents of that. And
Hmm.
then on top of that, you're trying to bring these all together to be able to say, okay, this is the overall impact of the event. Just the logistics of running an event, but also the logistics of being able to calculate the carbon emissions is quite remarkable. And
Hmm.
hats off. I'll say Andrea really tackled that very well. Same thing with Jack. Jack was working with council at the time as well, and we're very good partners to be able to help us calculate those emissions.
That's cool. I think one of the data point, I don't know if it falls under the gray data area, Brian, that I saw was the zip code
Mhm.
anomaly, right? This is more on as you look at the data, how zip code can play a role on, especially I think probably calculating or getting a true sense of the scope 3 emission, right?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of advantages, and it's easily available, and again, because of capacities, these event organizers will use the data that's readily available to them. And when someone registers for an event, they'll typically put in their address, whether their billing address or their shipping address. And so sometimes when you look, actually, were to do a comparison, and some might just choose shipping address or again their purchase address, which
Hmm.
could be different than their shipping, and they'll use one or the other. And if
I
you were
see.
to do a comparison, sometimes you'll actually find that the shipping address might be different than the billing address. And so
Mhm.
that might be someone living in a different area temporarily, but still has, they're registered with their credit card in this one area. But you're going to pull this data from there. And then the EPA provides a calculator that you can then input all of the zip code information. And then it will tell you, based off of their own assumptions, what the carbon emissions are from all those data entry points. There's challenges and limitations to that, which we're trying to address in some of our current work. Primarily, the EPA assumptions are based off of work commutes, not for tourism or leisure, like going to a race might be.
Mhm.
And so what we're trying to do is work with individual organizations to start to look at the unique behaviors and travel patterns of participants or spectators that are going to events so that the event themselves has their own assumptions based off of behaviors and patterns of, again, the participants or spectators. So then we don't have to rely on the EPA and we can get more accurate. And so from our preliminary analysis and other sport event contexts, what we found is the zip code data can up to 40% be inaccurate. So
Oh,
we might
wow.
already be overestimating in that regard.
Mhm.
And also from this preliminary analysis, when we were to use a specific model for an event, this was based off of sports spectator travel, but that the EPA calculations were actually overestimating by about 20%. So now we're starting to see inaccuracies
I see.
in kind of the methodologies that we've had in the past or approaches that we've used. And so we're really trying to work to, again, minimize assumptions and trying to get as solidified data as we can. So it's less gray and becomes more clear with regards to the data.
Oh, that's cool. That's good to know. But that 40% or the 20% to 40% is it's a big variation into the accuracy or if you're overestimating by that percentage for sure. Hopefully your the latest research can shed some light into maybe the reducing it down. You have certain recommendations. Actually, before you go into the recommendation, maybe an ask a question. Is travel the elephant in the room for scope 3?
Well, without a doubt. I mean,
Okay.
across anything, right? I mean, even having this conversation and recording this podcast has an environmental impact.
Yes.
And so there's, arguments on either side about the whether that's good or it's not. I mean, I would say this podcast is great, but having where people are coming from for a different event, whether a participatory event like these races or a spectator sporting event, it draws questions of, is this worth it? Is this sustainable? And so
Hmm.
we have to understand what is the, capacity of the local environment to be able to withstand this influx of people. How much is the increase really? So, looking at using as an example, how much was the increase in tourism to Paris during the Olympic Games over, every other year where, there isn't an
Hmm.
Olympic Games. So we really have to start to see where this marginal difference is and if that's starting to push us over the capacity of the local environment to withstand that. But scope 3 travel is the largest component of it.
Hmm.
And that's why we're trying to tackle that. So at least we understand and can start to say, okay, specific for this event and this team, this is kind of what your impact is in this regard. It can start to identify with the methodologies that we're using is trying to identify ways that we could try to reduce that.
Hmm.
But it kind of goes into the old adage of what gets measured gets managed. And we just want to make sure that we're measuring it appropriately so that we know what we're trying to tackle rather than trying to say, okay, well, these are based off of all of these assumptions, and we might start making significant decisions that have, positive, could have positive impacts, but we want to make sure again that we're going in the right direction in informing, our colleagues in industry as best as possible.
I see. I see. I mean, you have a couple of recommendations on the paper itself, and I'm sure your recent studies are also coming up with recommendations. So there are two parts to it. One is, say I'm a race director, an organizer for some small to large races. I think you had some of the biggest races part of your study, at least at least one of them I can see in the list that you have in the table 3 of the paper. What they can do? Like, what are your recommendations? I know you published the paper in 2023. I'm sure it have changed, but what they can do today?
Yeah. So, I mean, when we work with any industry partner, and this is the same in this case here with the council, and I mean, they're almost a middle person to then go into the race organizers,
Yeah.
but it's trying to make and provide as much frameworks as possible on, what data can be, uploaded, what's valid, what's not, right? So,
Mhm.
their analysis and their certification is only good as what gets put into it. And I
Right.
think, and they do a fantastic job of being able to certify and do that in an excellent way. So if these race organizers aren't submitting the data, then it doesn't add up, their points don't add up. So one thing would be kind of better inputs and working with organizers to understand kind of their challenges to then be able to improve the inputs. The other aspect too is with regards to scope 3, because that's the biggest, again, as you said, elephant in the room, is now starting to work on campaigns that you can start to educate the participants as they come to your event to try to use public transportation, at least when they're on site, or trying how can they sustainably get to the city or the region. And so those aspects are and can be successful. We've experienced that again with at least on site transportation. We worked with the USA Special Olympics, working with the caregivers, and we helped them devise campaigns to inform them and
Mhm.
educate them that when you get to the site, the games was playing that your badge also served as your light rail ticket around Seattle. And so, based off of our work, we realized before the games that about 78% of people were planning to rent a car when they were going to Seattle. Then, after the games and after the campaign, we surveyed them again and realized only 7% actually rented a car. So, campaigns like this are effective, and some practitioners sometimes feel as though they might be ineffective because you might have someone coming for a one off. But sometimes, well, from what we've found, those that are coming to a new city are very open to suggestions, right? They might be asking friends, they might be doing, looking online. So they are seeking out information. How can I get around? What's the best way? Where should I stay? So these informational aspects can be very informative, but also can help promote more sustainable behaviors, at least when they get on site. And so those are some things that can be done. The other thing is, you try to reduce as much as possible, and then you're offsetting. And I think from when we published this to kind of current times, I would say kind of the attitudes towards offsetting have shifted a little bit. And
Mhm.
so, I mean, you can offset, but you're also saying like, we're not ignoring the fact that, we still have impact and we still have rooms for
Right.
improvement.
Right.
And I think there are events that are in demand, like Cherry Blossom Run, that can, because you have this lottery, that you can build in, and whether you label that as a fee or you just build it into the cost of registration, an offsetting cost. But
Right.
to offset, you need to have all the data, and
That
so
is
you
true.
want to. So you want to make sure that you have a mature data set that you can be able to really, or a robust data set that you can really make sure that you can calculate what that is to know what you are offsetting. And by going through that exercise, I would argue that event organizers can start to see the efficiencies or perhaps inefficiencies in certain areas to then be able to tackle those to improve their environmental performance and perhaps even reduce their operational costs as well.
That brings up an interesting point. So I was chatting with Kate Chapman, the head of sustainability of at the London Marathon. One of the things I saw that they're doing really incredibly is they focus on reduction versus offset, because I think they have a it can be debated over for sure, but I would be curious your take on, shall the organizers focus on the reduction because that's more near term than offset? You probably are looking at, I don't know, based on 5, 10 years when you're going to offset the kind of emission from in one event. What is your take on it? How this organization should approach this?
I would 100% back that approach, right? You want to reduce as much as you possibly can.
Yeah.
And sometimes offsets get seen or actually are used in a organizational mindset as kind of like, okay, this is, it's the cost that we can do without having to again upgrade our efficiencies or kind of revisit how we're operating. But I would argue similar to the London Marathon that taking this approach like we need to reduce now
Mhm.
is the most important thing. One, it shows that we care, I would say in a much more immediate term. But also on top of that, it really starts to shift the organization from being reactive to being proactive. And so kind of
Right.
shifting from their heels to their toes so that they're actively looking at saying, like, look, we are a nimble organization. We are trying to figure out on a regular basis how we can do this. If we can reduce waste, that reduces tipping fee costs, with all these dumpsters, perhaps reduces staffing hours for cleanup and all these different things. So it goes back to my point that if we can look at this data and figure out where there's inefficiencies, you will start to recognize economic efficiencies that can be realized. And so again, we'll say environmental waste is economic waste. So let's try to figure out a way to identify where the environmental waste or damage is happening so then we can start to focus on these economic returns as well.
Got it. Got it. And I'm going to chat with some of the other big races too. So I'll be curious on their take on to their focus areas. I'm sure it's probably in the similar lines, look at reduction versus offset, or it's a combination of both. It's not a counter argument, but the recommendations that you suggested, and I'm curious if it so each race organizer, or the biggest ones, they have a economic impact report they produces. Some of the recommendations you have that may lead to the reduction in economic impact, especially in the scope 3 areas that you mentioned. I wonder if that is a constraint that you work with as you do research in this space.
So reduce. Sorry, can you
So
repeat?
let me give an example. For example, you give the example of the Seattle race where you say recommendation maybe if you creating awareness of the impact of the race, you may choose not to rent
Mm.
versus use the local transport. This contradicts the economic impact that
Oh,
the race organizers show to the town, the city that, hey, look at it. And some of the races bring in billions of dollars in one day event, right? I wonder if it poses a constraint on your research or any way you consider that part of your kind of the framework that you're working with.
no, that's a great question. Sorry, kind of missed your point the first time. I fully
No, no,
get
no.
it now.
I should have given an example to start with.
No,
Yeah,
no,
yeah,
that's
yeah.
great. No, we do, and we've made arguments in the past that sport organizations or events, when they are producing an economic impact report, the scope is very different than the scope of their
True,
environmental impact. So
true,
obviously, you
true.
want to make the the environmental impact as small as possible, and the
Right.
economic look as large as possible. So we've
Yeah.
argued that the scope should be exactly the same, and frankly, looking at the environmental impact of the economic activities surrounding the event. But you're right, it could dramatically reduce, or not dramatically, it could reduce the economic impact through taxes because less people are renting cars. They're
Hmm.
X, Y, or Z. But there are different ways that you can start to say, well, if they're not spending their money in this regard, if we're going on a vacation and I think it's looking like it's going to be $200 a day to rent a car, if we were, I mean, where we're going, we do need to rent a car, or what we think with 2 kids, we need to rent a car. But all that to be said, if we weren't spending that money, then we could start to say, well, now I got 200 extra dollars a day. Are we going to go spend that at a restaurant? Or are we going to go spend that, doing other things? And so, there are resources that could be not spent in one area, but could be spent in another. And so, I mean, your point is well taken, but from an economic efficiency standpoint, it's looking at it from the organizational standpoint.
Right.
But, I still would imagine it's still going to take a while for all people to adapt, or a majority of people to adapt. I don't think we'll ever get all.
Yeah.
But all that to be said, there are some probably ways that an economic impact would decrease because of changing certain behaviors, but you're shifting from economic power to one side to perhaps availing it to other opportunities as well.
That brings me to the point on the participants' point. So you listed a couple of areas that you concluded or recommended based on an organizer point of view. Like personally, as a runner, I love destination runs. Right? Some races I can bring my family over. They have a ball, exploring a new pace, and I also, put in some races and my goals that I'm chasing in, and it a win-win for, I do say that there's a family. What are the things maybe, and I'm going to deep dive in follow-up conversation on, and what does a sustainable runner means? What is your take on that? I know you have a couple of recommendations for individuals too on the paper.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, individuals can obviously kind of look to increase their efficiency. There's a lot of tourism research that shows that as people repeat the same type of vacation, that they actually reduce their impact
I see.
and actually reduce their to your other point, their economic impact as well,
Mhm.
because they realize where could be some more efficiencies in their own behaviors. And so that would be one thing for a runner to kind of really look at the most sustainable way that you can get to an event. That might include even perhaps purchasing offsets for your air flights or some things that are unavoidable. But then also making sure that the products that you're buying are have some certification, or at least are being sustainably produced, or at least disposed of appropriately at the end of its life cycle. But what a sustainable runner means, I really think that we have the challenge really of defining what sustainable means, and that I would operate under the assumption and the definition that others have for decades now, but like trying to preserve the natural environment for future generations.
Mhm.
And so as we kind of go through and look at our products, it's really understanding like, and I was just talking to my students this past week. Sometimes it gets ironic that, we're advertising products as sustainable. So please buy this product because it's sustainable.
Yeah.
And, we're I think we're under the altruistic view here. We're assuming that people are buying this because they need to, or, want this new product for a specific purpose. Obviously, that's consumerism. But we're also trying to promote something. It's like, well, buy this product to replace this other one that might
Right.
be less sustainable, to buy this new material and whatnot that comes with that. So when we look at this from a sustainable runner perspective, I think it's the way that the individual is training, the way that the products that they're buying, what they're putting into their bodies as well. There's different, obviously, sustainable diets, whether that's just completely plant based, buying more organics, buying foods that are from a specific geographic region from surrounding you. But there are all those different aspects. But those that are attending an event can look at, and event organizers can help with this by providing more sustainable accommodations that can reduce costs and not costs, but environmental impacts quite substantially, actually, when you start looking at these numbers at scale, and then promoting ways of getting around in a sustainable way once you're in town.
Mhm.
And so those are all different aspects, I think, that kind of go into what a sustainable runner could be.
Okay. A tough question, and I don't know. It shows up on your research. Do you think that the average runner actually do care about carbon footprint, or they care about their personal best or their PV?
Yeah, and there's a fantastic sports sociologist, How she's out there. She really questions when people are engaging in competitive sport, whether or not people see the environment as a means to the end or as an
Yeah.
equal means to their participation.
Yeah.
And I would hope that we would start to be able to shift individuals to see the environment as an equal part at the end, because if we were to you know have over tourism or overrun even a trail, we start to see the degradation of the environment. And so all that to be said, I think runners might be different than other types of consumers. One, because if those that are out in the environment, our research has shown if you're out in the environment more, that you're more likely to want to pass legislation and laws to help protect and preserve it. And actually, you're more likely to engage in wanting to preserve it. And this spans the political spectrum. This could be, you can look at it from Trouts Unlimited. So people wanting to protect local waterways, the habitats for whatever game or fowl that they might be hunting, you know but the same thing could be true and can be directly applied to those that are engaging in physical activity outdoors. And so those are a lot of aspects, I think, that kind of come into play. There are others that might see their fandom or their kind of identity with certain aspects, like a sport team, as
Mhm.
more transactional. And those are other aspects of our research that we're trying to explore about, like, how much do you actually care? Like, you might say
Right.
you care, and there are, plenty of polls that will say, people care about protecting the environment, but when the soul meets the road, like, really,
Yeah. Yeah.
what's it gonna take to say, okay, now I have to modify my behavior? Do I know how to? That's where those campaigns come into play. But am I willing to, for a variety of reasons? Because maybe I think that will hurt my performance.
Right.
But just as I think that was the Game Changer documentary about plant-based diets, started saying actually your athletic
Yeah.
performance could increase. And then
Right.
all of a sudden people are like, whoa, this is a little bit different. And it's really being
Yeah.
able to present that information and getting that into the hands of individuals that hopefully they start to modify and see where they can modify their behaviors to be more sustainable and match their values to their actions. Where typically we'll see what is commonly referred to as the value action gap. I have these values, but my
Right.
actions don't fully translate into kind of reflecting those values at all times.
Values. No, that's actually a good way to put it together. That actually, there's an alignment. You'll do something about it. The action will speak. It's not only the awareness that is needed, but it has, based on the values and the awareness, you should take actions towards it. Now, let's look into the future. With your work on the fifth national climate assessment, I think you're involved. What does the future of the big city marathon look like, say, in 20 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as some of the pioneers in the space, the larger, mega running events kind of lead the way, they'll help lead for innovation in the space. And, you know, I would hope that that translates down into smaller events. But, as typically as this industry is run, it's, you'll have a similar organization that are running multiple events. And so I would hope that as those organizations start to look at their efficiencies across all of the races, not just the individual races, that they can start to, if they are purchasing aspects or items that they can purchase at scale to the point where they can start where the increased cost for something that might be more sustainable is more marginal than it is kind of a detriment to engaging in that. But within the major metropolitan areas, I think, event planning is really starting to be optimized. There are different places that sometimes are still more difficult, but
Mhm.
additional coordination, and the race that's coming to mind only because we, lived close by is Houston. And
Right.
so, from where the race is being run to where you would fly into Bush International Airport or into Hobby, it's not as convenient from a public transportation standpoint. Are there
Yeah.
things that event organizers can do to help be able to, bring people closer to where they're staying,
Mhm.
assuming they're staying close to kind of where the race is being run, and then be able to move people around there? But that's ultimately what you're starting to see is like, how can race organizers take advantage of the infrastructure or overcome maybe some of the constraints of the infrastructure as well?
No, that's good. Thank you, Brent. What are the as you look into the future and then the gaps today exist? What are the questions you're asking to kind of get answers to in this space, or maybe the hard questions in a different way?
Yeah, we try to think about things that I would say in a very pragmatic way, and I mean, I would love to see the sport industry be as sustainable as possible. I think that's the overall intention. People want to do good, just like we talked about fans. Practitioners, I think, still want the same things, but there's other realities that they're trying to tackle, right? And trying to deal with what's in front of them immediately. And so one of the things that we're really trying to understand is, again, what are these challenges so that we can start to pick off and show
Hmm.
through data that those assumptions might be incorrect, right? Just like we're trying to change behaviors of practitioners saying, hey, or of participants saying, hey, if you were to purchase these products or do this or do that, you can
Yeah.
actually start to reduce your impact, increase your performance. We're doing the same thing and trying to approach the same thing with practitioners as well. And so those are some of the things that we're trying to understand are what are the biggest constraints in your mind and trying to get like very frank data versus just don't give me some flowery response, but tell me
Yeah.
like really what you're dealing with,
Yeah.
and let's work with that. And the same thing with fans within sport. YouGov came out with a report or a stat that said about 72% of fans want their teams to be more sustainable, right? And
Okay.
I agree. But at the end of the day, if a team's not being as sustainable as possible, fans are still showing up. And
Right.
so, it goes to that value action gap. So we're trying to understand kind of where that divide comes from.
Hmm.
Where does like, okay, you're doing enough and kind of checks that box in my mind, or where does it really become a problem where an organization really does need to respond? So that's from like kind of the operational and engagement side. But the other things too, like we're trying to tackle is how do we actually start to calculate these impacts which have been based off of assumptions, and our own work does have assumptions, is trying just to minimize the error that comes with those assumptions. And so we're trying to go through that process so that we can try to give some additional context to organizations, because it's very difficult to be able to communicate what we're doing as an organization with the public when the
Hmm.
public says, well, you're still doing that. It's like, you're
Right.
right. we're in this process. And so we've written a lot about, or like organizational humility, to be able to kind of say, yeah, you're right. We're not doing as great in that area. We're working on it,
Yeah.
but it's part of all of these things that we have to deal with. It's not like our main and sole priority. We still have to run a great event. We have to, if it's a spectator sport, win on the field. So there's
Yeah.
all these different components that go into it. And that's another thing that we're trying to kind of gauge from fans is, and some preliminary data shows that fans frankly don't realize that a sport organization or a sporting event is also a business. And so they're
Yeah.
limited in certain ways. And so those are some things to try to manage expectations on everyone's side so that we can say, like, look, we are making progress. This is how we communicate, how we're making that progress. So on the whole, people go, okay, I see that. All right. I see that you're working. And then, the humility, if they get called out, say you're
Right.
not fulfilling those things, that the organization goes, you're right. And then we'll make adjustments. And here's our response to that. So it has a more of a two-way communication rather than just being broadcast out in a one-way communication.
Cool. I think that the fan topic is a fascinating one. If I recall, one of the conclusions you had, which is more on future looking on the paper that we're looking at, was how do you measure the impact or the footprint of the supporters, right? Especially at mass
Yeah.
participation events like running. I'm the participant. I think a lot of data are collected on the participant level. Like I just mentioned, I take my family on some of my races. So how you actually kind of get the overall impact in that dimension. I don't know if there's any forward movement since you published the paper or how you're thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, definitely that's a major consideration, and even drawing from my own lived experience. I went to undergrad in upstate New York, and campus would almost be completely dead because everyone would leave and go to Boston for Patriots Day and all the festivities that go around with that. And so
Yeah.
it's not just the city itself celebrating, but it's again that big draw and magnet to be able to bring people in. And so that's a major consideration that we're trying to look at. That goes into even more of a scope 3 aspect because there is so much
Yeah.
pageantry that goes along with the event experience. It's not just the event or it's not just the marathon. There's obviously different races that are going on throughout the weekend.
Mhm.
And so it really is trying to capture that. We're starting at a smaller scale, but we're trying to work with different cities to start to see, again, the increase in tourism surrounding different events like this, to then say, okay, what is that? Again, that incremental increase to say, okay, this is like kind of the true additional impact that's happening because of this event versus a typical weekend. And so we're trying to work on that regard, but it is a lot and a lot of moving pieces, and that's the next thing we're trying to tackle. I think that'll keep me busy until the end of my career.
That's good to know, though, for sure. Dr. Brian McCullough, thank you for helping us understand the footprint of our miles. I'm sure folks can find your work in, I think, Texas A&M that you were before, and now University of Michigan now. So I'll share some links that people can find your work. And to our listeners, next time you enter your zip code for a race registration, remember, it's more than just a mailing address. It's a piece of the sustainability puzzle. So see you in the next run. And Brian, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.